8:17 p.m. I was standing at my kitchen sink, scraping the remnants of a half-eaten dinner into the garbage disposal, trying to push away thoughts of tomorrow's emergency meeting when my phone buzzed against the granite countertop. The sound cut through the evening quiet like a blade. 20 years of unwavering loyalty, of early mornings and late nights, of covering for mistakes that weren't mine. All of it reduced to a single, cold text message without even the courtesy of proper punctuation. But what Clara Brooks didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have imagined, was that in my silence over the past 2 decades, I had been the keeper of the company's most dangerous secrets. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how 20 years of quiet dedication became the foundation for the most satisfying revenge I could have ever imagined. I set my phone down with trembling fingers, the glow of the screen casting harsh shadows across my kitchen walls. The message was still there, stark and final. Sarah, your position has been eliminated, effective immediately. Do not come in tomorrow. We will mail your final check. No signature, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the 2 decades I had poured into Atlas Global Solutions, the logistics company that had become more than just my workplace. It had been my second home, my identity, my life. At 43, I had started at Atlas when I was barely 23, fresh out of college with a business degree and dreams that seemed limitless. I had watched the company grow from a small regional operation into a multi-million-dollar logistics powerhouse. I'd been there through 3 different CEOs, countless reorganizations, economic downturns, and boom periods. I'd been the constant, the reliable one. The person everyone turned to when systems failed or when the numbers didn't add up. And now, with a single text message sent on a Tuesday evening while I was doing dishes, it was over. I walked to my living room window and stared out at the suburban street where I had lived for the past 15 years. The mortgage I had secured with my steady Atlas income, the car in the driveway that I had purchased with confidence in my job security, the retirement plans I had built around my Atlas benefits, all of it suddenly felt precarious, built on sand that was now shifting beneath my feet. But as I stood there in the growing darkness, something else began to take shape in my mind. Not panic, not despair, but something colder and more calculating. Because Clara Brooks, in her arrogance and cruelty, had made a critical error. She had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, exactly what my role at Atlas had entailed over the years. I wasn't just another middle manager to be discarded when convenient. I was the institutional memory of the company. I was the one who knew where every digital body was buried, every shortcut that had been taken, every corner that had been cut. And most importantly, I was the one who had been quietly cleaning up Clara's messes for the past 3 years, ever since she had muscled her way into the CEO position. The phone buzzed again, and for a moment, my heart leaped with the irrational hope that it might be an apology, an explanation, something that would make sense of this betrayal. Instead, it was an automated message from Atlas HR. Please return all company property by end of business tomorrow. Your access cards have been deactivated. I set the phone aside and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then, for the first time in years, I smiled. Clara Brooks had no idea what she had just unleashed. The memories came flooding back as I sat in my darkened living room, each one a piece of the puzzle that would eventually become Clara's downfall. It had started 3 years ago when she arrived at Atlas like a hurricane in a designer suit, armed with an MBA from Wharton and a reputation for maximizing operational efficiency. The board had been impressed by her track record of turning around struggling companies. But what they didn't see, what none of them could have seen, was the trail of destruction she left in her wake. From her very first week, Clara had made it clear that she viewed the existing Atlas culture as an obstacle to overcome rather than an asset to leverage. She instituted mandatory efficiency reviews that were thinly veiled intimidation sessions. She restructured departments seemingly at random, breaking up teams that had worked together for years. She implemented new policies that prioritized cost-cutting over employee welfare or long-term stability. But it was the financial irregularities that had really opened my eyes to who Clara Brooks truly was. The first incident had occurred just 2 months into her tenure. I was reviewing the quarterly expense reports when I noticed a discrepancy in the operational costs for our largest warehouse facility. The numbers showed expenditures that were nearly 30% higher than the previous quarter, with no corresponding increase in volume or documented reasons for the spike. When I brought it to Clara's attention, expecting her to be as concerned as I was, she had merely glanced at the report and waved it away. "Must be a coding error," she had said dismissively. "Fix it and move on." But it wasn't a coding error. I spent 3 days tracing the expenses, following digital paper trails through multiple systems, and what I found made my blood run cold. Clara had been authorizing payments to shell companies, entities that existed only on paper but were ultimately controlled by her personal network. Equipment rentals that never happened, consulting fees for services never provided, maintenance contracts for work never performed. It was a sophisticated scheme that funneled company money into her personal accounts while maintaining plausible deniability. I should have reported it immediately. I should have gone to the board, to the authorities, to anyone who would listen. But Clara had already begun her campaign of psychological warfare against potential dissidents, and I had watched too many good people lose their jobs for asking the wrong questions. So instead, I made a decision that would haunt me for the next 3 years. I quietly corrected the records, documented everything, and said nothing. That was my first mistake, and it would not be my last. The second major incident had involved labor law violations that could have resulted in millions of dollars in fines and potential criminal charges. Clara had been pushing for increased productivity in our distribution centers, implementing quotas that were not just unrealistic, but actively dangerous. When warehouse workers began reporting injuries and filing complaints, Clara's solution was not to adjust the quotas, but to reclassify employees as independent contractors, thereby circumventing federal labor protections. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its callousness. By moving workers to contractor status, Atlas could demand longer hours without overtime pay, could avoid providing health insurance or other benefits, and could terminate workers without cause or process. The savings were immediate and substantial, but the legal and ethical implications were staggering. Once again, I found myself in possession of information that could have brought down Clara's entire operation. Employment contracts that had been backdated, safety reports that had been altered, federal forms that had been falsified. It was all there in the digital archives that I maintained as part of my role. And once again, I chose silence over confrontation. I told myself that I was protecting the company, protecting the thousands of honest employees who depended on Atlas for their livelihoods. I convinced myself that eventually Clara would make a mistake so obvious that others would notice. And then I could simply provide the documentation that would support the inevitable investigation. I was building a case. I rationalized, preparing for the day when justice would finally come. But justice had a funny way of taking its time. And in the meantime, Clara's confidence grew with each successful scheme. The third and most elaborate fraud had involved the manipulation of tax records, a scheme so complex that it took me months to fully understand its scope. Clara had created a web of subsidiary companies, each technically legitimate but ultimately designed to shift profits between jurisdictions in ways that minimized Atlas's tax obligations. Revenue that should have been reported in the United States was being routed through partnerships in Delaware, then to holdings companies in Nevada, before finally landing in offshore accounts where it was effectively invisible to federal oversight. The scheme saved Atlas millions in taxes, but it was also completely illegal. The paper trail was deliberately convoluted, designed to confuse auditors and make prosecution difficult. But I had been involved in setting up many of the digital systems that supported the operation, and I could see the whole picture in ways that others could not. By this point, I was no longer just a passive observer of Clara's crimes. I had become an active participant, using my administrative access to adjust records, create supporting documentation, and ensure that the various schemes remained hidden from routine oversight. I justified my actions by telling myself that I was gathering evidence, that I was building an ironclad case that would eventually bring Clara down completely. But if I'm being honest with myself, there was another reason for my continued silence. I was afraid. Clara Brooks was not just a criminal, she was a predator who had built her career by identifying and destroying anyone who posed a threat to her operations. I had watched her systematically eliminate potential rivals, had seen how she used a combination of corporate politics, personal intimidation, and strategic character assassination to remove obstacles from her path. She was ruthless, calculating, and utterly without conscience when it came to protecting her interests. And I knew that if she suspected I was aware of her activities, I would be next. So I kept my head down, did my job, and continued to document everything. I told myself that I was playing a long game, that patience would eventually be rewarded with the opportunity to bring Clara to justice. I created encrypted backups of critical files, maintained detailed logs of all suspicious activities, and waited for the perfect moment to act. What I didn't realize was that Clara was playing a longer game than I was. The changes at Atlas under Clara's leadership were like watching a slow-motion disaster unfold. What had once been a company built on relationships and mutual respect became a corporate battlefield, where paranoia and fear dictated every interaction. The open-door policies that previous leadership had maintained were replaced with rigid hierarchies and Byzantine approval processes. Employees who had once collaborated freely were now competing against each other for Clara's favor, knowing that falling out of her good graces could mean immediate termination. Clara's management style was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She would call sudden meetings with no agenda, leaving attendees to wonder if they were about to be praised or fired. She would make casual comments about dead weight and efficiency optimization while scanning the room, watching to see who flinched. She instituted a policy of quarterly performance calibration sessions where employees were ranked against each other, ensuring that someone would always be labeled as underperforming regardless of their actual contribution. The effect on morale was devastating. People who had worked together for years began to view each other as threats. Information that had once been shared freely was now hoarded as potential leverage. The collaborative spirit that had made Atlas successful was systematically destroyed and replaced with a culture of fear and competition. But through it all, I remained Clara's most reliable ally, though she never acknowledged it that way. Every time one of her schemes generated suspicious paperwork, I was there to clean it up. When regulatory agencies requested documentation, I was the one who ensured that what they received painted the picture Clara wanted them to see. When employees asked uncomfortable questions about policy changes or financial irregularities, I was the one who provided plausible explanations that deflected further inquiry. I became Clara's invisible shield, protecting her from the consequences of her actions while she remained blissfully unaware of the extent of my involvement. She saw me as just another cog in the corporate machine, useful but ultimately replaceable. She had no idea that without my constant intervention, her house of cards would have collapsed years ago. The irony was not lost on me. I was enabling the very person whose actions I found morally reprehensible, protecting someone who would not hesitate to destroy me if it served her purposes. But I told myself that I was gathering evidence, that every crime I helped conceal was another nail in the coffin I was building for Clara's eventual downfall. It was a dangerous game, and I was walking a tightrope between justice and complicity. But I believed that eventually, my patience would be rewarded with the opportunity to expose everything at once, to present a case so comprehensive and damning that Clara would have no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. What I hadn't anticipated was that Clara might decide to eliminate me before I had the chance to eliminate her. The end began with Hannah Brooks, Clara's 26-year-old niece who arrived at Atlas 6 months ago with a resume that was impressive on paper but thin on actual experience. Hannah had an MBA from Northwestern and had spent 2 years at a prestigious consulting firm, credentials that looked good in corporate directories but translated poorly to the practical realities of logistics management. Clara presented Hannah's hiring as a strategic addition to the leadership team, someone who could bring fresh perspectives and innovative approaches to Atlas's operations. The reality was more transparent to anyone paying attention. Clara was building a dynasty, placing family members in key positions to ensure her long-term control over the company. Hannah was given the newly created title of Director of Productivity Enhancement, a role that seemed to involve attending meetings, generating PowerPoint presentations filled with business school jargon, and implementing process improvements that typically made operations less efficient rather than more. She was paid a salary that exceeded what many 20-year veterans of the company earned, given an office that was larger than those of actual department heads, and treated with a deference that her contributions had not earned. The favoritism was obvious and galling, but it was also perfectly legal. Clara was the CEO, and she had the authority to hire and promote whomever she chose. The fact that her choices were based on nepotism rather than merit was frustrating, but not actionable. What I didn't see coming was that my own position would become the vehicle for Hannah's next promotion. It started with small changes to my responsibilities. Tasks that I had handled for years were suddenly reassigned to Hannah's department for process optimization. Reports that I had always prepared were now being generated by Hannah's team, though they invariably required my correction before they could be submitted. Meetings that I had routinely attended were restructured to exclude me while including Hannah as a stakeholder representative. The pattern was clear to anyone with experience in corporate maneuvering. I was being systematically marginalized in preparation for my removal. But I had survived 3 CEO transitions and countless reorganizations over my 20 years at Atlas. I had seen ambitious newcomers come and go while I remained constant and reliable. I believed that my institutional knowledge and consistent performance would protect me from Clara's family politics. I was wrong. The final blow came during what I thought was a routine quarterly planning meeting. Clara had called together the senior staff to discuss budget allocations for the upcoming fiscal year, a process that I had participated in for nearly 2 decades. I arrived prepared with detailed analyses of departmental needs, historical spending patterns, and recommendations for cost optimization that would achieve Clara's financial targets without compromising operational effectiveness. But instead of the collaborative discussion I expected, I found myself facing what amounted to a trial. Clara began by questioning every recommendation I made, challenging assumptions that had guided Atlas's budgeting process for years, and dismissing my analyses as outdated thinking that failed to account for modern realities. Hannah, meanwhile, presented an alternative budget framework that was heavy on consulting fees, technology investments, and organizational restructuring, coincidentally, all areas where she would have significant influence. Her presentation was polished and filled with impressive graphics, but it was also fundamentally flawed in ways that anyone with actual operational experience would have immediately recognized. When I attempted to point out the practical problems with Hannah's proposals, Clara cut me off mid-sentence. "Sarah," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I appreciate your long service to this company, but I think it's time we brought some fresh thinking to these processes." Hannah's approach aligns with the strategic direction we're taking Atlas in the coming years. The message was clear. My experience was now viewed as a liability rather than an asset. My institutional knowledge was outdated thinking. My 20 years of reliable service were being reframed as an inability to adapt to modern realities. I should have seen it coming. I should have recognized that Clara was not just repositioning me but preparing to eliminate me entirely. But I was so focused on the long-term game of documenting her crimes that I had missed the immediate threat to my own position. That night, I went home and reviewed everything I knew about Clara's operations, looking for leverage that I could use to protect myself. The evidence I had accumulated was overwhelming, enough to destroy Clara completely if presented to the right authorities. But using it would require me to admit my own complicity in covering up her crimes. And I wasn't sure I was ready to make that sacrifice. I decided to wait a little longer, to see if Clara would back down from whatever plan she was implementing. I thought I had time to maneuver, to find a way to protect both myself and the evidence I had gathered. I was wrong about that too. The betrayal, when it came, was as brutal as it was unexpected. I had just finished a particularly difficult day of cleaning up after another of Hannah's process improvements, this one involving a complete reorganization of our inventory management system that had resulted in 3 major shipment delays and 2 customer complaints. I was exhausted, frustrated, and looking forward to a quiet evening at home when my phone buzzed with that fateful message. "Sarah, your position has been eliminated effective immediately. Do not come in tomorrow. We will mail your final check." No warning, No severance negotiation. No opportunity to transition my responsibilities or collect my personal belongings. 20 years of service ended with a text message that contained 43 words and zero compassion. But what made the betrayal even more painful was discovering how it was being celebrated. Through contacts I still had at Atlas, I learned that Clara and Hannah had gone out for an expensive dinner that very evening to celebrate what Clara called the completion of our organizational restructuring. They had chosen a high-end steakhouse downtown, the kind of place where entrees started at $50 and the wine list required a small loan. According to my source, they had ordered champagne and had spent the evening toasting Hannah's expanded role and Clara's decisive leadership. While I sat in my kitchen, staring at the text message that had destroyed my career, they were celebrating their victory with premium aged beef and bottles of Dom Perignon. The mental image of their celebration burned in my mind as I tried to process what had just happened to me. But alongside the hurt and anger, something else was beginning to take shape. For 3 years, I had been playing defense, quietly cleaning up Clara's messes while building a case for some future reckoning. I had been patient, methodical, and careful, always waiting for the perfect moment to act. Well, Clara Brooks had just handed me that perfect moment on a silver platter. As I sat in my dark living room, staring out at the suburban street where I had built what I thought was a secure life, I began to remember things that Clara had clearly forgotten. I began to take inventory of the power that I still possessed, the access that I still maintained, the knowledge that only I possessed. Clara Brooks had made many mistakes over the years, but the biggest one was assuming that getting rid of me would also get rid of the problems I represented. She had eliminated the person, but she had forgotten about the systems, the access rights, the administrative privileges that I had accumulated over 2 decades of faithful service. In her arrogance and haste, Clara had fired the one person who knew all of her secrets while leaving me with all of the tools I needed to expose them. It was a fatal error, and I was about to make her pay for it in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The realization came to me slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape that had been hidden in darkness. As I sat in my living room that night, moving through the stages of shock, anger, and hurt that follow any devastating betrayal, my mind began to work through the practical implications of what had just happened. Clara had fired me, but she had not revoked all of my system access. This wasn't an oversight born of incompetence. It was the inevitable result of Atlas's complex IT infrastructure and the critical role I had played in maintaining it over the years. As someone who had been with the company for 2 decades, I had accumulated administrative privileges across multiple systems, some of which were so specialized that only I fully understood how they functioned. The most important of these was the Employee Retirement Fund Management System, a complex piece of software that handled the investment and distribution of Atlas's pension obligations. It was a system that Clara had never shown any interest in understanding, dismissing it as back-office administrative stuff that was beneath her attention. She left it entirely in my hands, never realizing that this indifference was giving me access to millions of dollars in employee assets and the ability to trigger oversight mechanisms that could bring down her entire operation. The retirement fund system had been my special project for the past 5 years, something I had taken over when the previous administrator retired. It was highly automated, designed to minimize manual intervention and reduce the risk of human error. But it also included several built-in safeguards and audit triggers that could be activated if certain conditions were met. One of these safeguards was an independent audit function that could be initiated by any system administrator if they detected irregularities in fund management or suspected fiduciary violations. Once activated, this audit would be conducted by an external firm that specialized in pension compliance, and it could not be canceled or modified by anyone at Atlas, including the CEO. It was a feature that had been included at the insistence of the legal department, designed to protect the company from potential liability if pension funds were mismanaged. The theory was that by having an independent mechanism for detecting and reporting problems, Atlas could demonstrate due diligence and potentially avoid criminal prosecution if irregularities were discovered. What the legal department hadn't anticipated was that this safeguard could also be used to expose executive malfeasance if someone with the right access and knowledge chose to activate it. As I sat in my darkened living room, the implications of this realization began to sink in. I had the ability to trigger a comprehensive audit of Atlas's financial operations, an investigation that would be conducted by professionals whose job was to find exactly the kind of irregularities that Clara had been hiding for years. And because I had been meticulously documenting Clara's crimes for the past 3 years, I knew exactly where the auditors should look to find the most damaging evidence. But there was more. In building her sophisticated schemes for tax evasion and embezzlement, Clara had made extensive use of the retirement fund system to move money between accounts and jurisdictions. She had treated it as her personal slush fund, borrowing against employee assets to finance her shell companies and then using the profits from those companies to make the payments back before anyone noticed. It was a dangerous game of financial musical chairs, and it had worked only because I had been there to ensure that the movements were properly documented and concealed. But now, with me gone and my detailed knowledge of the system out of her reach, Clara was sitting on a time bomb that she didn't even know existed. The beauty of the retirement fund audit was that it would be completely legitimate. I wouldn't be seeking revenge through sabotage or corporate espionage. I would be using established corporate safeguards exactly as they were designed to be used. I would be protecting employee assets from potential mismanagement, fulfilling my fiduciary duty as a fund administrator, and ensuring compliance with federal regulations. The fact that this legitimate action would also expose Clara's crimes and destroy her career was simply a happy coincidence. But first, I needed to make sure I had everything I needed to make the audit as effective as possible. Over the next several hours, I methodically accessed every system where I still maintained administrative privileges, downloading files, copying databases, and creating comprehensive backups of all the evidence I had been collecting for the past 3 years. I worked through the night, driven by a combination of adrenaline and pure determination, knowing that Clara would likely move to revoke my remaining access as soon as she realized her mistake. The evidence was even more damning than I had remembered. Clara's shell company scheme had grown far beyond what I had initially discovered, encompassing dozens of fake entities and millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. The labor law violations had expanded to include multiple facilities and had resulted in several worker injuries that had been covered up to avoid regulatory scrutiny. The tax evasion operation had become so complex that it would take federal investigators months to untangle all of the connections. But the most shocking discovery was how extensively Clara had been looting the employee retirement fund. What I had initially seen as occasional borrowing against employee assets had actually been systematic theft on a massive scale. Clara had been using retirement fund money to finance her personal investments, to pay for her lavish lifestyle, and to fund her various illegal schemes. The amount involved was staggering. Over $15 million had been diverted from employee accounts into Clara's personal network. The employees of Atlas, many of whom had been with the company for decades and were counting on their pensions for retirement security, had been unknowingly financing Clara's criminal empire. It was a betrayal that went far beyond mere corporate misconduct. It was theft from the very people whose hard work had built the company's success. As I compiled this evidence, my anger began to crystallize into something colder and more focused. This wasn't just about my personal betrayal anymore. Clara hadn't just fired me, she had been stealing from every employee at Atlas, including many people I considered friends. She had been putting their financial security at risk to fund her own greed, all while presenting herself as a visionary leader who was building Atlas's future. By the time the sun rose, I had everything I needed: comprehensive documentation of Clara's crimes, detailed evidence of the retirement fund manipulations, and complete instructions for where auditors should look to find the most damaging proof. I had also prepared a detailed timeline of events showing how Clara's criminal activities had escalated over the past 3 years and how they connected to her broader pattern of corporate misconduct. Most importantly, I had prepared a formal request for independent audit, written in the careful legal language that would make it impossible for Clara or anyone else at Atlas to dismiss or delay. The request cited specific regulatory requirements, referenced potential violations of federal pension law, and included enough supporting evidence to make it clear that this was not a frivolous accusation. At 9:17 a.m. on Wednesday morning, exactly 13 hours after receiving the text message that had ended my career, I submitted the audit request through the retirement fund system's automated compliance portal. The system confirmed receipt of my request and informed me that the external auditing firm would be contacted within 24 hours. Once the audit was initiated, it would proceed according to federal guidelines and could not be canceled or modified by Atlas management. Clara Brooks had fired me via text message, but I had just fired back with the full weight of federal regulatory oversight. The wheels of bureaucracy began to turn with surprising speed. By Thursday afternoon, less than 48 hours after I had submitted my audit request, the external compliance firm had already contacted Atlas's legal department to schedule their initial review. The firm, Morrison & Associates, specialized in pension fund compliance and had a reputation for thoroughness that made corporate executives nervous even when they had nothing to hide. For Clara, who had everything to hide, their involvement was about to become a nightmare. I learned about these developments through Sarah Chen, a friend in the legal department who called me Thursday evening with barely contained excitement in her voice. Sarah had been one of the few people at Atlas who had openly questioned some of Clara's policies, and she had paid for her candor with marginalization and implicit threats to her job security. She was thrilled to see Clara finally facing consequences for her actions. "Sarah," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "what did you do? Clara has been in emergency meetings all day, and the entire executive team looks like they've seen a ghost. HR has been running around like headless chickens, and there are rumors that the board is calling an emergency session." I feigned ignorance, though I couldn't keep the satisfaction out of my voice entirely. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I was fired, remember? I'm not privy to Atlas business anymore." "Cut the crap." Sarah laughed. "This has your fingerprints all over it. Morrison & Associates doesn't just randomly decide to audit pension funds. Someone had to request this. Someone with administrative access and detailed knowledge of the system. The only person at Atlas who fits that description is you." She was right. Of course. But I wasn't ready to admit my involvement, even to someone I trusted. "I suppose it's possible that someone noticed irregularities in the pension fund management," I said carefully. "If that's the case, an audit is exactly what's supposed to happen. It's a built-in safeguard to protect employee assets." "Employee assets," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting way to put it. Sarah, please tell me you found something really bad. Please tell me that Clara is finally going to get what she deserves." The hope in her voice was painful to hear. Like so many Atlas employees, Sarah had been watching Clara's reign of terror for 3 years, hoping that someone would finally hold her accountable for the damage she was inflicting on the company and its people. The fact that justice might finally be coming was almost too good for her to believe. "I think," I said slowly, "that if there are problems with how the pension fund has been managed, the auditors will find them. Morrison & Associates has a reputation for being very thorough." "God, I hope so." Sarah breathed. "Do you know what it's been like here since you left? Hannah has been running around like she owns the place, making changes to everything without consulting anyone who actually knows how things work. She tried to reorganize the entire shipping department yesterday and managed to lose track of 3 major orders. 3. And when the customers complained, she blamed the warehouse staff for not adapting quickly enough to her innovative processes. This was exactly what I had expected. Hannah might have an impressive resume, but she had no practical experience in logistics operations. Without me there to quietly fix her mistakes, she was about to discover that running a complex business required more than PowerPoint presentations and business school theories. The whole company is falling apart." Sarah continued. "People are scared, confused, and angry. Everyone knows that you were the one who actually kept things running smoothly. And now that you're gone, everything is starting to unravel. If Clara thought she could just replace you with her incompetent niece and nothing would change, she's about to learn how wrong she was." As satisfying as it was to hear about the immediate consequences of my departure, I was more interested in what was happening with the audit. "What exactly has Clara been told about the pension fund review?" I asked. "Not much, apparently." The legal department got a call from Morrison and Associates saying they were initiating a compliance audit based on a formal request they had received. Clara tried to find out who had made the request, but apparently the process is confidential until the audit is complete. She's been going crazy trying to figure out who could have triggered it. Perfect. The confidentiality provision meant that even if Clara suspected my involvement, she couldn't confirm it or take action against me. She was trapped in a situation where she knew an investigation was coming but couldn't influence or stop it. The best part, Sarah continued with obvious glee, is that Hannah tried to suggest that they could just cancel the audit, like it was some kind of internal review that management could control. The lawyer had to explain to her that once a formal compliance audit is initiated, federal regulations require that it be completed regardless of what the company wants. Clara's face when she realized she had no way to stop this was apparently priceless. This was even better than I had hoped. Not only was the audit proceeding exactly as planned, but Clara and Hannah were revealing their guilt through their obvious panic and their attempts to interfere with the process. Any competent investigator would immediately recognize that innocent parties don't try to cancel regulatory audits. When do the auditors actually start their work? I asked. Monday morning. They're sending a team of 4 people, and they've requested access to all financial records going back 5 years. They've also asked for copies of all executive compensation records, vendor contracts, and subsidiary company documentation. Clara has been trying to figure out if there's any way to limit the scope of their investigation. But the lawyers keep telling her that the auditors have broad authority to examine anything that might affect pension fund management. 5 years of records would capture everything. All of Clara's schemes, all of her shell companies, all of her manipulations of the retirement fund, it would all be there for the auditors to find. And because I had been documenting everything so meticulously, they would have a clear trail to follow that would make their job much easier. Sarah, I said, unable to keep the satisfaction out of my voice entirely. I think Clara Brooks is about to have a very bad week. God, I hope so. This company deserves better than her. And so do all the people who work here. If she's been doing something illegal with our retirement money... Sarah's voice trailed off as the implications sank in. If she has been, I said gently, then the auditors will find it, and there will be consequences. Real consequences. After I hung up with Sarah, I allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. Everything was proceeding exactly as I had planned. Clara was trapped in a situation of her own making, facing an investigation that she couldn't control or stop. Her panic and that of her supporters was already revealing their consciousness of guilt, making the auditor's job even easier. But I knew that the real fireworks were yet to come. Morrison and Associates hadn't even begun their actual investigation yet. They were still in the preliminary phase, gathering documents and preparing their analysis. Once they started digging into the actual financial records, once they began to see the patterns that I had been tracking for years, that's when Clara's world would really start to collapse. I had waited 3 years for this moment. 3 years of watching Clara commit crime after crime while I documented everything and waited for the perfect opportunity to act. Now that the opportunity had come, I was determined to savor every moment of her downfall. Clara Brooks had taught me that in the corporate world, loyalty was a weakness to be exploited and kindness was a vulnerability to be attacked. She had shown me that people like her succeeded by being ruthless, calculating, and utterly without conscience. Well, she was about to discover that I had been an excellent student. The weekend passed slowly, each hour bringing me closer to Monday morning when the auditors would begin their work. I found myself unable to concentrate on anything else, constantly checking my phone for updates from contacts still inside Atlas, refreshing news websites in case the story somehow leaked to the media, imagining the conversations that must be taking place in Clara's executive suite as she tried to prepare for an investigation that she couldn't possibly survive. On Sunday evening, I received another call from Sarah in legal, this one with even more encouraging news. "You're not going to believe what happened on Friday afternoon," she said without preamble. Clara called an emergency meeting with all the department heads, supposedly to discuss operational coordination during the audit period. But what she actually did was try to coach everyone on what to say to the auditors. This was exactly the kind of mistake I'd been hoping Clara would make. Attempting to coordinate testimony or influence witness statements during a federal investigation was itself a serious crime, one that could result in additional charges beyond whatever the audit itself uncovered. What kind of coaching? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. She basically told everyone to minimize any problems they might have observed, to emphasize how well the company has been performing under her leadership, and to make sure the auditors understood that any irregularities were probably just administrative oversights rather than intentional policy violations. Please tell me someone was taking notes, I said. Better than that, Marcus in accounting was recording the whole thing on his phone. Apparently, he's been documenting Clara's behavior for months, just in case he ever needed to protect himself. When Clara started talking about coordinating responses to auditor questions, Marcus realized he was witnessing potential obstruction of justice and made sure to get every word. Marcus Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran of Atlas's accounting department, a meticulous professional who had always been scrupulously honest in his work. If Clara had managed to alienate someone like Marcus to the point where he was secretly recording meetings, it showed just how far her reign of terror had spread throughout the company. Is Marcus planning to share that recording with the auditors? I asked. He's already made copies and stored them in multiple locations. He told me he's going to wait and see what the auditors ask about, but if they inquire about any attempts to influence their investigation, he's prepared to provide them with complete documentation. This was perfect. Not only would the auditors find evidence of Clara's financial crimes, but they would also have proof that she had attempted to obstruct their investigation. It was like watching someone dig their own grave and then jump into it. There's more, Sarah continued. Hannah apparently suggested that they should try to remove certain documents from the files before the auditors arrive. She actually said they should clean up the records to make sure there weren't any confusing entries that might mislead the investigators. I had to laugh at that. Hannah's suggestion wasn't just evidence of consciousness of guilt, it was also completely pointless. All of Atlas's financial records were backed up in multiple locations, and many of them were automatically archived by federal regulation. Even if they managed to destroy some physical documents, the digital trail would still be there for investigators to find. Please tell me someone explained to her that destroying documents during a federal investigation is a felony. I said, actually, that's exactly what happened. The general counsel went white as a sheet and immediately shut down that line of discussion. But the damage was done. Everyone in that room now knows that Clara and Hannah are scared enough to consider destroying evidence. Word is already spreading throughout the company that there must be something really serious for them to be acting this desperate. The psychology of it was fascinating. Clara's attempts to control the situation were actually making it worse, creating more evidence of wrongdoing and turning more employees against her. Her panic was infectious, spreading throughout the organization and undermining any remaining loyalty she might have commanded. How is the general counsel handling all this? I asked. Atlas's legal department had always been conservative and risk-averse, exactly the kind of lawyers who would be horrified by the situation Clara had created. Terrified, Sarah said bluntly. The word from inside the legal department is that they're preparing for the worst-case scenario. They've already retained outside criminal defense counsel for the company, and there are rumors that they've been advised to cooperate fully with the investigation and distance the company from Clara's actions as much as possible. This was an encouraging development. If Atlas's lawyers were already thinking in terms of criminal defense and cooperation with investigators, it meant they had seen enough evidence to know that Clara's problems were serious and potentially prosecutable. They were preparing to throw her under the bus to protect the company, which meant she would be facing the investigation without institutional support. What about the board of directors? I asked. Have they been briefed on what's happening? Emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning, before the auditors arrive. Supposedly, it's just a routine briefing on the audit process, but everyone knows it's actually a crisis management session. There are rumors that some board members are already asking whether Clara should be placed on administrative leave pending the investigation results. The board's involvement was the final piece I'd been waiting for. Once the directors understood the scope of Clara's misconduct and the potential liability it created for the company, they would have no choice but to act decisively. Clara's fate would no longer be in her own hands. It would be determined by people whose primary concern was protecting Atlas and its shareholders from the consequences of her crimes. Monday morning arrived gray and rainy, perfectly matching the mood that must have been prevailing in Atlas's executive offices. I found myself waking up early, energized by anticipation despite having nowhere particular to go. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was finally on the offensive rather than constantly playing defense. At exactly 9 a.m., Morrison and Associates would walk through Atlas's front doors and begin the investigation that would destroy Clara Brooks. I wished I could be there to see her face when she realized that her carefully constructed criminal empire was about to be dismantled by the very regulatory safeguards she had been too arrogant to understand. Instead, I made myself a cup of coffee and settled in to wait for the updates that I knew would be coming throughout the day. I had done everything I could to set this process in motion. Now it was time to let federal investigators do what they did best. The first call came at 11:30 a.m. from James Patterson in the IT department. James had been one of my closest colleagues during my years at Atlas, and he was clearly enjoying the chaos that was unfolding. "Sarah, you should see this place right now," he said, barely able to contain his laughter. The auditors showed up exactly on time with briefcases full of documentation and laptops loaded with forensic accounting software. Clara tried to greet them personally and give them some kind of prepared speech about Atlas's commitment to compliance, but they just asked her to direct them to the records they had requested and told her they would contact her if they needed anything else. "How did she react to that?" I asked. Like someone who just realized she was in way over her head. She kept trying to insert herself into their process, offering to explain the context for various documents or to provide additional background information, but they made it clear that they preferred to examine the records independently first, and that they would schedule formal interviews with management later if necessary. This was exactly how professional auditors operated, and it was clearly not what Clara had expected. She was used to being able to control corporate processes through force of personality and executive authority. But federal investigators operated according to their own procedures and couldn't be intimidated or manipulated. "The best part," James continued, "is that Hannah tried to follow the auditors around like some kind of corporate tour guide, explaining how she had been implementing new efficiency measures and how any irregularities they might find were probably just artifacts of the transition to her new systems. One of the auditors finally had to ask her politely but firmly to let them work independently. I could picture the scene perfectly. Hannah, desperate to protect the position she had stolen from me, trying to charm and confuse investigators who were trained to see through exactly that kind of performance. She had no idea how transparent her behavior was to people who specialized in uncovering corporate misconduct. "What are they actually looking at?" I asked. "Everything. They've set up a conference room as their base of operations, and they've been requesting files from every department. Financial records, vendor contracts, payroll data, executive compensation documentation. They're building a complete picture of how the company operates. And Sarah? They're asking very specific questions about the retirement fund management system. Someone definitely pointed them in the right direction. That someone had been me, of course, but I wasn't about to admit it. Instead, I focused on the implications of what James was telling me. The auditors were following the trail of evidence I had laid out for them, asking the right questions and examining the right documents. Everything was proceeding exactly as I had hoped. "How is Clara handling the pressure?" I asked. "Badly. She's been in and out of meetings all morning, and every time she comes out, she looks more stressed than before. Hannah has been trying to act like everything is normal, but you can tell she's terrified." The two of them keep having these intense whispered conversations in Clara's office. And Clara's assistant says the phone has been ringing constantly with calls from lawyers and board members. The image of Clara and Hannah huddled together in crisis mode was deeply satisfying. For 3 years, they had been the predators, using their positions of power to exploit and intimidate employees who couldn't fight back. Now, they were the ones who were scared and desperate, facing an investigation that could destroy everything they had built on the foundation of other people's suffering. "James," I said, "I want you to know how much I appreciate you keeping me informed about all this. I know it's risky for you to be talking to me." "Are you kidding?" He laughed. Everyone here knows that Clara fired you to make room for her useless niece, and we all know that you were the one who actually kept this place running smoothly. If you're somehow responsible for what's happening to her now, then more power to you. She deserves everything she's about to get. The loyalty of my former colleagues was touching, but it also made me realize how much damage Clara had done to the Atlas corporate culture. The fact that employees were openly rooting for their CEO's downfall showed just how completely she had failed as a leader. She had created such a toxic environment that people were willing to risk their jobs just to see her face consequences for her actions. The second call came at 2:15 p.m., this time from Amanda Foster in Human Resources. Amanda had always been professional and discreet, so the fact that she was calling me at all suggested that the situation at Atlas had reached crisis proportions. "Sarah," she said without preamble, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you have anything to do with triggering this audit?" I considered my response carefully. Amanda was calling me for a reason, and I suspected it wasn't just curiosity. "Why do you ask?" "Because I've been reviewing the timeline of events, and the audit request was submitted less than 24 hours after you were terminated. That's an awfully big coincidence, especially considering that you were one of the few people at Atlas with administrative access to the retirement fund system." Amanda was smart, and she had clearly put together the pieces of the puzzle. But I still wasn't ready to admit my involvement, especially over a phone line that could potentially be monitored. "I suppose it's possible that someone noticed irregularities around the same time that I was let go," I said carefully. "If there were problems with the retirement fund management, an audit would be the appropriate response." "Sarah," Amanda said urgently, "I'm not asking because I want to get you in trouble. I'm asking because I think you might have done exactly what needed to be done, and I want to make sure you're protected." This was unexpected. Amanda had always been loyal to Atlas management, carefully neutral in corporate politics. For her to be suggesting that Clara deserved to be investigated suggested that the problems were even more obvious than I had realized. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean that I've been watching Clara's behavior for 3 years, and I've seen things that didn't make sense, expense reports that didn't add up, vendor payments that seemed excessive, personnel decisions that appeared to violate company policy. I've been documenting everything, but I never knew what to do with the information. I didn't have the authority or the knowledge to piece it all together." This was a revelation. Amanda had been conducting her own investigation of Clara's activities, independently collecting evidence of misconduct. If she was willing to share what she had discovered with the auditors, it would provide additional corroboration for everything I had documented. "Amanda," I said slowly, "if you have evidence of misconduct, you should definitely share it with the investigators. You have a duty to the company and to the employees to make sure that any wrongdoing is exposed." That's exactly what I plan to do. The auditors have already requested interviews with several HR personnel, and I'm scheduled to meet with them tomorrow afternoon. I'm going to tell them everything I know and provide them with all the documentation I've collected. This was better than I could have hoped. Not only would the auditors have my carefully prepared evidence trail to follow, but they would also have independent corroboration from Amanda's investigation. Clara's crimes would be exposed from multiple angles, making it impossible for her to claim that any irregularities were simple mistakes or administrative oversights. "There's something else," Amanda continued. "I've been getting calls from other employees who want to share information with the auditors. People who have been afraid to speak up because they were worried about retaliation, but who now see this as their chance to tell the truth about what's been happening here." The floodgates were opening. Clara's reign of terror had created so much resentment and suppressed anger that employees were now eager to cooperate with investigators. Instead of facing a hostile workplace that would protect her, Clara would be confronting an organization full of people who were ready to testify about her misconduct. "How many people are we talking about?" I asked. "At least a dozen so far, and more are coming forward every hour. Warehouse workers who were pressured to falsify safety reports, accounting staff who were told to manipulate financial records, supervisors who were ordered to reclassify employees to avoid paying benefits. It's all coming out now." The scope of Clara's misconduct was even broader than I had realized. While I had been focused on the major financial crimes, she had apparently been committing smaller acts of corruption throughout the organization. The auditors wouldn't just find evidence of embezzlement and tax evasion, they would uncover a pattern of systematic abuse that touched every aspect of Atlas's operations. By Tuesday evening, the situation at Atlas had escalated beyond anything I had imagined possible. The auditors had been working for less than 2 full days, but they had already uncovered enough evidence to justify expanding their investigation and bringing in additional specialists. Sarah called me with an update that left me speechless with satisfaction. "The auditors found something big," she said without preamble. "I don't know exactly what it is, but I can tell you that Clara was called into an emergency meeting with the board of directors this afternoon, and she came out looking like she had seen a ghost. Word is that the board has suspended her pending the completion of the investigation." Clara Brooks, the woman who had ruled Atlas through fear and intimidation for 3 years, had been stripped of her power in less than 48 hours. The audit I had triggered was working exactly as intended, exposing her crimes and forcing the board to take action to protect the company. "What about Hannah?" I asked. "Suspended as well. Apparently, the auditors found evidence that she was directly involved in some of the questionable transactions they've been investigating. She tried to claim that she was just following Clara's orders, but given that she's been at the company for less than a year, that defense isn't going to get her very far." The image of Hannah, so arrogant and dismissive just a week ago, now suspended and facing potential criminal charges, was almost too satisfying to believe. She had thought that being Clara's niece would protect her from consequences, but federal investigators didn't care about family connections when they encountered evidence of criminal activity. "Is there any word on what specific violations the auditors have identified?" I asked. "Nothing official, but the rumors are incredible. Embezzlement, tax evasion, violation of federal labor laws, misappropriation of pension funds. They're talking about charges that could result in decades in prison. And apparently it's not just Clara and Hannah. The auditors think there might be other executives involved, people who helped facilitate the schemes or who knew about them and failed to report them." This was the outcome I'd been hoping for, not just punishment for Clara and Hannah, but a complete investigation that would expose everyone who had been complicit in their crimes. Atlas would finally be cleaned of the corruption that had been poisoning it for years. "Sarah," I said, "I have to ask, how are you feeling about all this? I know it's been a difficult time for everyone at the company." "Are you kidding?" she laughed. "This is the best thing that's happened at Atlas in 3 years. People are walking around with smiles on their faces for the first time since Clara took over. Yes, it's scary not knowing what's going to happen next, but anything is better than continuing to work under her regime of fear and intimidation." This was exactly what I had hoped to hear. The investigation wasn't just exposing Clara's crimes, it was liberating the employees who had been suffering under her rule. The fear and paranoia that had dominated Atlas's culture for 3 years was finally being replaced by hope and anticipation for a better future. The final phase of Clara's downfall began on Friday morning with a call that I had been both expecting and dreading. Detective Michael Thompson from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division was calling to schedule an interview about my knowledge of financial irregularities at Atlas Global Solutions. "Ms. Mitchell," he said in a professional but friendly tone, "I understand that you were recently employed at Atlas in a position that gave you access to financial systems and records. We're conducting an investigation into potential violations of federal law, and we believe you may have information that could be helpful to our inquiry." The moment I had been preparing for had finally arrived. The audit had uncovered enough evidence to trigger a full criminal investigation, and now I would have the opportunity to share everything I knew with federal law enforcement, all of the documentation I had been collecting for 3 years, all of the evidence I had been carefully preserving, would finally be put to its intended use. "I'd be happy to cooperate with your investigation," I said. "I have extensive knowledge of Atlas's financial operations, and I'm aware of several irregularities that you might find interesting." "We appreciate your willingness to assist," Detective Thompson replied. "Would you be available to come in for a formal interview early next week? We'd like to record your statement and review any documentation you might have that's relevant to our investigation." "Absolutely. And Detective Thompson, I should mention that I have considerable documentation of the issues we'll be discussing: financial records, email communications, detailed timelines. I've been keeping careful records for quite some time. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear the detective's interest intensifying. That sounds very helpful. Ms. Mitchell, please bring everything you have when you come in. The more documentation we have, the stronger our case will be. After I hung up, I allowed myself a moment of pure triumph. The investigation had progressed exactly as I had planned, moving from internal audit to criminal investigation in less than a week. Clara Brooks, who had thought she was untouchable, was now facing federal charges that could destroy her life just as completely as she had tried to destroy mine. But the most satisfying part wasn't just that Clara would face justice. It was that her downfall would restore integrity to Atlas and protect the employees whose lives and financial security she had been endangering. The retirement funds that she had been looting would be secured. The toxic corporate culture she had created would be cleaned up, and the company that had been my professional home for 20 years would finally be free of her corruption. The final call came on Sunday evening, 3 days before my scheduled FBI interview. It was Marcus from accounting, calling with news that provided the perfect capstone to Clara's destruction. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with amazement, "Clara's been arrested." I felt a surge of satisfaction so intense that I had to sit down. "When? What are the charges?" "About 2 hours ago. FBI agents showed up at her house with a warrant. The preliminary charges are embezzlement, tax evasion, violation of federal pension laws, and conspiracy to commit fraud. But I'm told there will probably be additional charges as the investigation continues." Clara Brooks, who had ruled Atlas like a tyrant for 3 years, was now sitting in a federal detention facility facing charges that could send her to prison for the rest of her life. The woman who had fired me via text message was learning what real consequences felt like. "What about Hannah?" I asked. "Arrested at the same time, same charges." Apparently, the FBI had been building cases against both of them based on the evidence the auditors uncovered. There are rumors that they found millions of dollars in stolen money and that more arrests are coming. The image of Hannah, so smug and entitled just a week ago, now facing federal charges alongside her criminal aunt, was almost too perfect to believe. She had thought that nepotism and privilege would protect her from the consequences of her actions, but federal law didn't recognize family connections as a defense for criminal behavior. "Marcus," I said, "thank you for letting me know. This has been an incredible week for everyone at Atlas." "Sarah," he replied seriously, "I don't know if you had anything to do with starting this investigation, but if you did, I want you to know that every honest employee at this company owes you a debt of gratitude. Clara and Hannah were destroying Atlas, stealing from us, and treating us like dirt. Justice has finally been served." As I hung up the phone, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. A week ago, I had been a loyal employee who had just been betrayed and humiliated by the person I had been protecting for 3 years. Tonight, I was the architect of the most comprehensive corporate justice story I had ever witnessed. Clara Brooks had taught me that in the modern corporate world, loyalty was weakness and kindness was vulnerability. She had shown me that people succeeded by being ruthless, calculating, and utterly without conscience. She had demonstrated that the only thing that mattered was power, and that those who had it could do whatever they wanted to those who didn't. Well, I had been an excellent student. I had learned her lessons perfectly, and I had applied them with a patience and precision that she never could have imagined. I had been ruthless in documenting her crimes, calculating in my timing of the audit request, and utterly without conscience when it came to destroying someone who had tried to destroy me. The difference was that I had used those qualities in service of justice rather than greed, to protect innocent employees rather than exploit them, to restore integrity rather than destroy it. Clara Brooks had fired me via text message after 20 years of faithful service, thinking that would be the end of our story. Instead, it had been the beginning of hers. The audit I triggered had exposed millions in stolen funds, led to federal criminal charges, and liberated Atlas from 3 years of corruption and fear. As I sat in my living room on that Sunday evening, watching the news report about the arrests at Atlas Global Solutions, I felt a sense of peace and satisfaction that I hadn't experienced in years. The woman who had tried to destroy my life was now facing the destruction of her own. And the company I had served faithfully for 2 decades was finally free of her poison. I had waited 3 years for justice, documenting every crime and preparing for the perfect moment to act. When that moment came, I had acted with precision and patience, using the very systems and safeguards that Clara had been too arrogant to understand. Sometimes revenge is best served not hot or cold, but exactly at the right temperature, at exactly the right time, with exactly the right evidence. Clara Brooks had fired me, but I had fired back with the full weight of federal law enforcement. She had tried to end my career with a text message, but I had ended hers with an audit request that triggered the most comprehensive investigation in Atlas's corporate history. The game was over, and I had won completely.